Hello, folks. Welcome to the Washington County Public Affairs Forum. Today, we are going to have a very interesting program. Before I announce the program, I'm going to say if I didn't offend you as your past president, I'm back, and I'll do my best to do that again today. Got a couple things to report. The Peppermill asks that for the use of this room, that they would normally add a 20% gratuity to the bill. Their computer system is down. Would you put a little something in for the servers, please? I also want to point your attention to Mr. Nick Wilson. Nick is a audio-video guru, and I've snagged him for the day. He works in the Portland film industry and was curious about what we do. He's given up his day. Would you give him some applause for making us sound good? I'd like to set the tone of the presentation through a time machine. We're going to hit rewind to go back to April 1865. This is a presidential press conference, and our president is going to speak for a half hour as a president and then take your questions. Your job as engaged and informed citizens would be line up as normal and ask your questions, but in the context of a living president in a press conference circa 1865. If I could ask for some applause again, because I'd like to introduce someone special, and that is our president. Would you please welcome our president?
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to see so many members of the press here with us today. Now, I know that a lot of you have complained that I never talk about myself, but you see, I've never wanted my personal history or my purely personal views to be an issue. However, I don't wish my reticence to become an issue, and so today, with a terrible national nightmare through which we have been struggling for 4 years, so nearly at an end, I'm going to break with precedent a little bit and yammer about myself, reluctantly. I say that and I hardly know where to begin. Begin at the beginning, I reckon. I was born February 12th, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. Grew up on small farms there and in southern Indiana, and later as a young man in Illinois that were all hard work and little reward. My folks, my mom and my pa, were strong anti-slavery people. And I took that attitude in with the air I breathed as a child and a young man. Now, I didn't care much for farm work. Well, the truth is I hated it. And I realized, though, if I was going to do anything else with my life, I'd have to make something of myself. I wish I could say I'd done that through long years of hard study in school, but the truth is, I don't reckon I spent more than 1 year altogether in one classroom or another. But somehow, by the time I'd come of age, I'd learned to read and to write, and to multiply, too. Well, up through my threes, anyway. That's as far as I got. And I decided, after trying my hand at a couple of other endeavors, a grocery store, surveying, boating things down the Mississippi, that I'd become a lawyer. Didn't go to law school neither. I did what we called reading the law, serving as an apprentice in a law firm until I could join the bar and start my own practice. And long about these same years, I thought, well, maybe I wanted to become a public figure. So I ran for the Illinois State Legislature, won 3 terms there. And by the middle 1840s, now this political career was going well enough, in addition to the lawyering, which I did to put bread on the table. Political career was going well enough that the Whig Party, of which I was a member, agreed that it was my turn to run for Congress. You see, we had kind of a safe seat there in central Illinois. And some of us members of the party, well, we agreed among ourselves that we would each take a turn, serving a single term back in Washington. So I got myself elected in 1846. The following year, went out as a member of the United States House of Representatives. Now, you might ask, what'd you do there? I opposed the war with Mexico. I thought it was wrong. Big country picking on a small one. And I made some speeches, but I didn't make the mark that I hoped that it would. The only piece of legislation I even thought of throwing into the hopper was one to outlaw the slave trade, at least in our nation's capital. But I found that I lacked the support and, well, maybe the resolve even for that. So at the end of my 2-year term, I left Washington, leaving our nation's capital pretty much unchanged by my brief tenure there. Went back to Springfield, Illinois, in my law practice, which I found were pretty much unchanged by my absence. And if anybody asked, I told them I was through with politics, or politics are through with me. In any case, I reckon that political career was over. Went back in the courtroom, me and my partner, Billy Herndon, his name, and we did well. Had a house built for my wife Mary and our boys. But over the next few years, this problem of slavery, which had plagued our Union from its inception, turned into a crisis. When the Supreme Court of the United States of America declared that no black man had any right, that any white man had to respect in a court of law, and they intimated that perhaps no state could constitutionally outlaw slavery. Well, I began to think maybe there was something more important than patent law and railway rights of way. So after nearly 10 years out of office, I jumped back into politics, filed for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas. Now, Douglas, you see, he had helped to tear apart the Missouri Compromise, which was a series of measures limiting the growth of slavery. And that was what was keeping our Union together. So by tearing that apart, well, I had a bone to pick with Senator Douglas. And he and I would travel the state laying our case out before the people of Illinois in a series of debates that, well, it went something like this. Well, now, yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's taken a lot to get this old war horse out of the stall. I seek an office, senator in the national government in Washington, that I never thought that I'd be seeking. And we've got to talk about something that I had hoped in this year of 1858 would never again be a national issue. Now, slavery is an evil, but we are not responsible for it here in the state of Illinois. We long ago banned slavery, and neither the Congress nor the President has any constitutional authority to interfere with slavery in those states where it exists. But now the extension of slavery into those territories not yet even organized as states, that's something else again. Like most of you here, I reckon if we can just stop the growth of slavery, it's going to wither away and die on its own. Now I know my opponent and his supporters, they're always telling me that all this about slavery extension, well, that's just a minor matter. A minor matter? How? Yes, sir. Could I ask you, how many legs would a sheep have if you called a tail a leg? Could you tell me? 5. No, just 4. Because you see, calling a tail a leg don't make it so. I don't mean to embarrass you here in front of everybody. I reckon you're not a sheep man. Calling a tail a leg don't make it so, and my point is calling this a minor matter don't make it so neither. I read from slave owners how slavery is beneficial to the slave. Well, maybe I've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe we should start slavery over again here in Illinois, and I know how we'll do it. We'll start with volunteers. Anybody here who would like to be a slave? You know, I've been asking that question for weeks now. It's been mighty slim pickings. Okay, we'll start it another way. We'll start with those who would enslave others. If they want to tell us how beneficial slavery is to the slave, well, let's try it out on them, see how they like it. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a slave owner. Now, I know my opponent says I'm being two-faced on this issue. But ladies and gentlemen, I ask you now, do you reckon that if I had 2 faces, I'd be wearing this one? No. No. Think about our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, how can a slave consent to the government over him, What we need to do is re-adopt the Declaration of Independence, those policies and practices that harmonize with it. And you know what will happen if we do? If all Americans, North and South, should join in this great and good work. But we will not only have saved this Union, but we shall have so saved it as to make it and keep it forever worthy of the saving. Well, as I suppose you know, I lost that election. It was mighty hard. Mighty hard. I asked my law partner, Billy. I said, Billy, will you take my folding knife away from me, lest I do something foolish with it. But what I thought was the end of my public career, others saw as the beginning. Folks started coming to me, telling me I'd gained national attention, even in my loss to Stephen Douglas. They told me I could have the presidential nomination of the new Republican Party because they said I was the one man who could stop the growth of slavery and so save this Union. Well, I can't very well stand up here in front of you and tell you I'm not an ambitious man, can I? No one knows until that presidential grub starts gnawing at him just how deep it'll get until he's tried it. Well, I won the nomination of the Republican Party, and with the United Party behind me and our opponents split up just as our Union was threatening to split up, I won the election in November. But within days of that election, Southern legislators began to vote unconstitutionally, illegally, for secession, forming the so-called Confederate States of America. For the first couple of weeks of this administration, we worked night and day trying to resolve this crisis without bloodshed. But when rebel troops bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina, in Charleston Harbor, the war began. Some folks acted like they'd been looking forward to it. Oh, it was all going to be over quick and easy, they said. Nothing but a picture book war. Nobody really hurt. Well, the only thing that happened quickly and easily is that the story of this rebellion became a chronicle of political wrangling and military setback. I put a fellow named McClellan in charge of the army, and for months he would not move despite my urgings. When he finally got going, he got his army close enough to Richmond, Virginia, the rebel capital. He could hear the church bells ringing on Sunday mornings. Then the fighting started, and our soldiers, they did well, but McClellan retreated after every victory that he gained. That was back when every member of my cabinet thought he could do this job better than I was doing it. And half the members of the Congress scoffed at me. But here was my dilemma. I could not gain the full support of the considerable number of abolitionists in the Congress who control the balance of power unless I were to free the slaves. But even if I'd had the constitutional authority to end slavery, which I did not, I couldn't free anybody unless we won this war. And for the first year and a half or so of this conflict, if I had made any move to end slavery, the forced slaveholding the states that stayed with the Union, well, they'd have quit and joined the other side, and we'd lost this war. That was back when I was telling anybody who'd listen to me, I hoped throughout this contest to have God on my side, but I had to have Kentucky. We were certainly in no great danger of winning the war back then. Month after month, thousands of our boys were dying behind men who called themselves generals, men that I'd appointed. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, in a personal way it did. My son Willie, developed a fever. Children get fevers, I know that. And his mother and I would sat up every night with him. But he died, and I you'll pardon me. I received a letter from Frederick Douglass, the noted abolitionist, himself a former slave. And he wrote to me, "You fight this war with only one hand, Mr. Lincoln. The Negro is the key to the situation, the pivot on which the whole rebellion turns. Teach the rebels and traitors that the price they are to pay for their attempt to abolish this government must be the abolition of slavery. I knew he was right, and I decided at the time had come. Now, as I said, I had no authority to end slavery, but I believed strongly as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, I did have the authority to deny rebels any resource that furthered their ability to oppose this people's government. And so in September of 1862, a year and a half into this conflict, I issued a proclamation of emancipation, not ending slavery, but freeing all slaves who lived in areas controlled by the rebels. Now that's all I could do, and I did it. Some people say I'm a slow walker, but I never have to walk back. I was painfully aware that the proclamation did not free anybody at that point under our control, but only those who were not under our control. Now, howling started right away. Some folks said, well, I don't care what the Constitution says, you should have freed all the slaves. Others said I had exceeded my authority even with this measure. They called me a tyrant, a dictator. The press weighed in. I hope nobody will be offended if I read a couple of selections, but I'll tell you what, if you'll pardon me for reading it, I'll pardon you for writing it. How's that? New York Herald. This president and his administration are now adrift on a current of radical fanaticism. Baltimore Sun. There. The cowardly tyrant who now disgraces the chair of Washington and Jefferson could any day have peace and restoration of the Union. And he would have them. Only he insists on continuing this war merely to free the slaves. Merely to free the slaves. But there was this from a soldier of the Union armies. It is no longer the Union as it was that is to be reestablished, but the Union as it should be, washed clean of its original sin. We are no longer merely the soldiers of a political controversy. We are now the missionaries of a great work of redemption. What had begun as a conflict over union had become a revolution over men's souls. From that day on, this was altogether a new war. And yet, in so many ways, it seemed like nothing had really changed. Especially here in the East, where so much attention is focused, our armies knew nothing but defeat. I finally fired McClellan, late in 1862, told me he had the slows. Replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside, who, yeah, he proved to be a disaster. Just months after I appointed him, I had to replace him with General Joseph Hooker. And fighting Joe Hooker, he was just a disaster of another kind. So just months after I appointed him in the summer of 1863, I had to relieve him of Commander General and replace him with General George Meade. And now General Lee, he took his rebel army across the Potomac into the north and he disappeared. Anybody who was here in Washington back then knows the tension in this city is so heavy you could hardly breathe. But our soldiers, they had a new spirit now. They didn't care who was general anymore. They knew that a defeat at this point would mean the end of the war, end of our Union. And defended now their homes, their families. They were determined that this should not happen. Well, the two armies finally stumbled into each other just across the Pennsylvania state line in a little town called Gettysburg. And there they fought for 3 days with this Union hanging by a thread every moment of that battle. Until finally, on the last day of that fight, for the first time in this war, our forces sent back the main attacking force of General Lee's army, and they sent them running from the field. But the cost. 8,000 men dead in 3 days. 50,000 men wounded. A great dedication was planned for the cemetery. They laid out a cemetery in the hills above Gettysburg, see? And dedication of that cemetery was planned for the fall. Come on in. Come on in. Dedication of that cemetery was planned in the fall of '63, November that year. Finest orator of our day, Edward Everett, was called on to express the solemn pride of the nation. As a kind of afterthought, the organizers asked me if I would come up from Washington and, how they put it, deliver a few appropriate remarks. They were hoping I would say no, as I have not been popular. But I told them yes, for I had something to say. After Edward Everett had spoken for over 2 hours, I stood up. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do so. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what was said here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who have fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be so dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I dream often that I'm on a ship which has broken loose from its moorings, a ship of which I am the captain, but I cannot steer it. It seems that in any great conflict, both sides claim to be acting in accordance with God's will. But God can't be both for and against the same thing at the same time, can he? God wills this struggle. He wills that it not end yet. By his mere quiet power, he could have saved or destroyed the Union without a human conflict. But the conflict began, and having begun, continues, to achieve some great purpose that we do not fully understand. Well, as the fall of 1863 turned into the winter and spring of '64, that great victory at Gettysburg seemed like nothing more than a tantalizing glimmer of light in a world of gloom. My friends, not to mention my enemies, told me that I could not gain re-election in the fall, and I agreed with that assessment. I reckon that when November came around, the people of this country were going to send me packing back to Springfield, where I could once again take up the practice of law. But just last summer, as you can recall, late in the summer of 1864, the fortunes of our armies on the field of battle took a tremendous turn for the better. And for the first time, folks thought, well, maybe they could see an end to this war coming. So when Election Day rolled around, they decided they wanted me to stay. And I figured, well, that's what they want. I reckon I better do it. Anybody here from Harper's Weekly? Harper's Weekly put it, long Abraham Lincoln, a little longer. Well, just a couple weeks ago, as you know, I put together some remarks for the ceremony of my second inauguration. You know, I think a lot of people were expecting me to hit a note of triumph in that speech, to say we were about to win this war because we were right. And God was, after all, on our side. I really think that's the sort of speech people expected me to give. I gave them this one instead. I'll bring this forward just a little bit. At my first appearance to take the oath of the presidential office 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. But one side would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Both sides read the same Bible and they pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. The prayers of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own intentions. Woe unto the world because of offenses, says the Bible, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offenses came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills it to continue until all of the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, we've seen dramatic events in the last few days with the surrender of General Lee's army in Virginia on Sunday and the surrender of General Johnston's army in North Carolina expected hourly. This war is essentially over. This nation is something new now, something it could not have been before. Maybe we have finally washed away something of our original sin and we can stand newborn and redeemed. Maybe because of that new birth, God will find a way to forgive us. Well, I said I didn't want to talk about myself, and I've been yapping for I don't know how long. Please forgive me. I know that your readers are waiting for news from the Capitol with the end of the war. We hope so quickly upon us. And so with your readers in mind, I'll take questions. Who has a question for the President? Yes, sir.
Can you guys come up to the microphone and ask the question?
Mr. President, I'm Spencer Ehrman from the New York Times.
Mr. President,
we're a young paper.
I'm
We're fighting.
Spencer Ehrman from the New York Times.
We're a young paper, but
There's
we're
a
feisty.
fellow in
Yes, I
Move
know
Away
well.
from the War for a second.
There's a fellow in Move Away from the
in New
War
York
for
who
a second.
over the last few years
There's a fellow
bought up a lot of real estate.
in New York who over the
And,
last few years
I don't know what it,
bought up a lot
I
of
guess
real
he
estate.
figures if he's got his,
And
it's
I don't know
time
what
to
it,
shut the door.
I guess he figures if he's
talking
got
about
his,
walling off
it's
the
time
port
to shut the door.
and not
because
allowing.
He's
I
talking
think he's
about
a native
walling
ins-
off the port.
and he doesn't
and not
want to
allowing.
doesn't
I
want
think
to
he's a
allow any
native.
more immigration
And
from
he
Ireland
doesn't want
and
to
Germany.
doesn't want to
and-
allow any more
and,
immigration from Ireland
Italy.
and Germany
He's tired of
and,
all the people
and
coming in.
I
was wondering, what do you say?
He's
now
tired
he's
of all the
talking about
people
running for
coming in.
national office.
I was wondering, what
He
do
thinks
you
that he
say?
could be
And now he's
president
talking about
after
running
you.
for national
Well,
office.
he
He
will
thinks that he
do
could
it.
be president after you.
I assume he's part of what is called the Know Nothing Party. Mugwumps,
Uh-huh.
they're occasionally called, because they have the mugs on one side of the fence and the wumps on the other, I'm told. Now this country is a nation of immigrants. None of us had our ancestors born here. So how can we draw the ladder up after us? We need people. We've got the West so empty. It needs people badly. I expect a lot of the former slaves will go out west, find land out there. But a man like that, I believe strongly, has no future in this country. You might as well try to stop the tide as to turn back the many people who will come here and make this country great. As you probably know, something like 35% of the Army of the Potomac does not speak English as their main language. Many of them do not speak English at all. But they have found it fit to defend this country and to fight for freedom. And I think as long as we believe in this country, we believe in freedom, I think it would be fit if we found a place for them.
I think our readers appreciate that
Thank
point
you
of
very
view,
much.
sir. Thank you.
Mr. President, I am Peter Wong from the Herald Tribune, another newspaper.
Mr. President, I am Peter Wong from the York Tribune, another newspaper you
Mr.
probably
President,
know
there
well.
I know
are
very
members
well.
of your own party in Congress
Mr.
who seem to
President,
have
there are
different ideas
members of your
about
own party
what
in
should be
Congress
done with
who
the
seem to have
southern
different
states now that
ideas
the war
about
is over.
what should be done with
They
the southern
differ,
states now that the war is over.
from what
they
I think
differ,
your policies. How do you
from
propose
what,
to
I think your
handle them,
policies,
given
how
that
do you
the party is
propose to
still
handle
relatively
them,
young?
given that
Well, they are,
the
there
party
are
is still
fractious elements in
relatively young.
doubt about it. And Reconstruction is called, that's the question of the hour. I do not want to see retribution against the people of the South. I want this to be an easy peace. They've always been our countrymen, despite some delusion to that effect. There were always strong pro-union sentiments in all of these states. I recall that when the issue of secession was being debated, even in the hotbed of secession in South Carolina, one of its representatives stood up in opposition, saying South Carolina is too small to be a republic, and it is too large to be an insane asylum. And it will be neither. It has remained a state, and I want to see. There's an old story about the Irishman who went on the wagon, went down to the saloon, ordered a coffee. Well, the bartender wasn't accustomed to this. And he says, "You sure, Patty?" He says, "Absolutely. I've gone on the wagon, and I'll never have an order of alcohol again, just coffee. Although, if you were to slip a little rum into it, unbeknownst to me, well, that would be fine." And so some of the leaders of the South were to slip away unbeknownst to me, I suppose that would be fine too. And we will reconstruct this country. We have a Freedmen's Bureau to help the difficult transition from slavery to freedom for the former slaves, setting up schools and other institutions. And I trust we can put this country back together again. Thank you, Mr. President. You're welcome.
Mr. President, I'm Bill Kroger from the San Francisco Chronicle. I have two quick questions. First one is if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with General U.S. Grant, The second question is that you have a reputation, when you were especially on the circuit with the attorneys in the state of Illinois, of being quite a jokester and being sort of the life of the party. And I was just wondering if you could maybe tell us a joke or two. You did a few minutes ago.
Okay, I got one in mind, but first about General Grant. I got some criticism in the last few months because of the heavy toll of the campaign in Virginia. And I know even General Lee has criticized him. General Lee always had kind words to say about the various generals who were in command, and was harsh only towards Grant. And I thought, well, what is the difference between these other generals and General Grant? And I came to the conclusion the difference is that General Grant beat him. General Grant showed he was very capable of campaigns of very quick, decisive action. That's Forts Donelson and Henry. He was unfortunately surprised at the Battle of Shiloh, but he showed he could keep his wits about him, keep a very steady nerve, and won that battle on the second day. He undertook one of the great sieges of history, I think will be taught as long as military science is studied, at Vicksburg, a supposedly unassailable city that he reduced and conquered. And then here in the East, though great deal of criticism has been placed on him, we put him in command of the army, an army that for 3 years known mostly defeat, and retreated back across the Rappahannock River after being bloodied by the rebels so many times. And within a year, he won the war. And I think that's how he will be remembered. And as far as jokes go, I can only think, perhaps it's not so funny. When I was a young man, you see, I had only one distinction. I was very proud of it. I was the ugliest man in our county. And then I was told that a family moved in to the county, and the father of that family, well, he was apt to give me a run for my money, I was told. Well, what was I going to do? I grabbed a mule and a shotgun. That's what I did. Went out to greet him. And so I went out, and he was out. I found him out there plowing in his field, and he looks up at me and said, well, it's mighty kind of you to come out here and visit a new family, but I'm made a little uneasy by that shotgun, sir. What exactly is your intention? And I told him, I've always been the ugliest man in this county, and I can see right now you're going to take my place. And so I've come out here to shoot you. And the fellow said, well, I'm beginning to think you ain't so neighborly after all. But the truth of it is, if I'm uglier than you are, go ahead and shoot. Any other questions? Another question for the president? Well, if not, then I thank you very much. My duties call me elsewhere. I'm very weary, but there's a great deal of work I've got to get done before I can take that last train ride home. Maybe just one question back there, yes?
You know, I know that I've been through the Springfield, through all the stuff there, and I know that the death of your son was just devastating to the family, and I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that. Didn't your wife end up having some mental problems later on because of all that?
Well, with your indulgence, I will only say I've talked about that enough. Thank you, yes. I have no more to say on that. Good afternoon.
Well, hey, folks, that wraps up another forum. We're going to have next week the Washington County Family Justice Center present, and then our last forum program of this season will be Professor Jim Moore from Pacific University. He's going to give us a primary election wrap-up and then also a preview of what's going on with the general election in the fall. I'd like to remind you that if you'd like to renew, you can do so online for either an individual or a group membership, or you can see Tim or myself and we can process the transaction here. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.